But let's get to the big story. Of course, three of the biggest global institutions have kicked off the new year with warnings or forecasts that indicate a tough time ahead for the world economy. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank have predicted small growth on the back of crisis upon a crisis since the 2020 pandemic. Today, ahead of next week's annual summit of global leaders in Davos, Switzerland, the World Economic Forum held a panel of experts to assess current global risks. Here is an excerpt.
What the report draws from is a global survey of about 1,200 experts looking at economic, societal, technological, geopolitical, and environmental risks. And we tried to look at three different time frames. So what is currently unfolding today, year zero, what do things look like in 2023, what's top of the agenda, what things look like 2 years out by 2025, and then what do things look like 10 years out by 2033. So that's how we've tried to analyze these risks, looking at least 31 in total, but then of course looking at the interconnections between them. What we find is that when it comes to today, energy crisis at the very top, food crises, cost of living. 2 years out though, the experts are still expecting that the cost of living is going to be the #1 risk on the global agenda. 10 years out, especially in the top 10, 6 of the top 10 global risks are dominated by climate and environmental related risks and risks that are associated with that. So for example, large-scale involuntary migration makes it into the top 10 as well, in fact the top 5 over the longer term. So that's how things play out, which means if we come back to today, leaders are facing multiple crises that are happening at the same time, so essentially polycrisis. And what that leads to in terms of the sort of overall optimism or pessimism about the state of the world, when we asked leaders what they're expecting to happen, well over 80% are expecting that we're looking at consistent, ongoing crises that are compounding each other, an increasingly volatile trajectory, although 10 years out, we're looking at that number going down to about 50%. So still a fairly negative outlook, even a decade out. So that's how things play out overall. And perhaps one more implication of that, we're looking at a situation where things are eerily familiar to some extent, a lot of older risks that have come back to the fore, things that if we think back to the beginning of this decade, we were trying to be on a trajectory to solve, dealing with hunger, dealing with energy crises. These were things that the world was trying to move towards and help solve through the Sustainable Development Goals. Quite a different picture today with things like re-emerging health crises and food crises and energy crises and the cost of living. And at the same time, some newer risks layered on top of that, that certainly today's generation of leaders has not had to deal with recently. So widely speaking, inflation, widely speaking, a potential recession on the horizon, trade wars at a time where just up until 3 or 4 years ago, we were in a very different picture around trade. So this combination of geopolitical and economic risks, and then layered yet on top of that, climate risks that haven't been so front and center as they are today. We did look at climate mitigation risks in addition to the risk of not acting fast enough on adaptation, and both come out at the very top 10 over the next 10 years. I'll stop there, Adrian.
Thanks, Sadia. Cost of living crisis was mentioned as being right in the foreground for the next 2 years. Carolina, can you unpack a little bit of what the implications of that are for businesses, and perhaps some of the other business-focused risks that come out in the report?
With pleasure. And Sadia, thank you. Your overview really paints a picture of a volatile and constantly changing risk landscape where risks are surprisingly interconnected and one will impact and exacerbate another. And this will certainly have an impact in terms of how businesses look at their strategies and investment decisions going forward. And when I have conversations with companies about their own risk outlooks, I would say that the lists of concerns are growing longer and longer. And there are a couple of themes that stand out. And one is the navigating the inflationary environment and the cost of living crisis. But it's also about access to raw materials and components. And of course, securing up supply chains and making sure that those are a little bit more solid. And I think all of those concerns are closely linked to the compounding risks outlined in this year's report. And one example is food insecurity, which has increased due to major reductions in grain exports, lack of fertilizer, and climate change events as well. No country is immune to social erosion caused by lack of affordability and availability of basic necessities. And that's really important for us to recognize. Cost of living pressures and food insecurity could provoke civil unrest and instability. Last year, for example, we saw the impact of rising fuel prices that led to protests and in a number of countries with strikes and political upheaval. So we have seen the impact already. And of course, businesses need to keep an eye on these political risk scenarios as well as the increased geopolitical tension in the world, because it creates complexity in terms of managing risks in supply chains. And the war in Ukraine has impacted access to raw materials and minerals, but it's also led to sanctions and trade restrictions that has had an impact on other goods and services as well. And as a result of this, we now see how companies are turning from a just-in-time approach to a more just-in-case strategy. And that we see that in terms of bringing production closer to home, nearshoring, friendshoring, stockpiling, but also we see a trend of vertical integration, meaning that companies are actually looking to acquire both suppliers and clients in order to take control of the whole chain. So that's an interesting trend to watch. I think the relative predictability of the business environment has gone down, which is really forcing companies to allow more slack in the system and be willing to invest a little bit more upfront in order to stay in business and build the needed resilience. Secure energy is, of course, also crucial for supply chain resilience, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine highlighted Europe's energy vulnerability. And many countries have increased their reliance on coal to keep lights on and factories running. But I think we're at the point now where we have to recognize that we're not going to be able to solve the energy crisis by next winter. And it's not about surviving this winter or next winter. It's about surviving the next 5 winters. And it's also about summers and extreme heat waves that can put pressure on power grids. And in all this, of course, we have to remain committed to long-term climate ambitions. And I think investments in speeding up the green energy transition should be central to enhancing energy security. Of course, we cannot forget about cyber risks as well, cyber attacks, because there are more entry points than ever before as companies have continued to accelerate digitalization, automating their processes. And add to this, of course, the risk of cyber warfare that is highlighted in this year's report. This is an area where public and private partnership is incredibly important to provide better protection against these risks. So what do we do? Well, we need to take a step back and start planning for the unexpected. And I think, generally speaking, most of the things that we worry about are too short-term and modest. So taking a long-term and holistic view at the risks on the risks horizon, making sure that we have diversity around the table when we talk about risk and resilience, to make sure that all different perspectives are being captured. Because I do think that if we work together, we are able to prepare for and respond to these compounding risks with better agility. We might even be in a position where we can create a more secure future. So I think that those are my comments. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Carolina. You very well expressed there the kind of short-term things on leaders' minds. Does that sort of mean that John, climate change is not now climate change. We're too busy looking at other things, and we've put it off into the distance yet again.
Well, Adrian, it's been 30 years since the Earth Summit at Rio de Janeiro in 1992. And during that time, we've seen intense climate diplomacy, climate activism, and yet here we are in today's world where we really just are not doing enough. We know that because at COP27, the UNFCCC issued a report that described a world where in the next 7 years, by the end of the decade, we have a 50% chance of breaching the 1.5 degree limit, which is enshrined or built into the Paris Agreement. So it feels like that we're really challenged in terms of achieving our climate objectives. And in fact, in the Global Risk Report of this year, the failure of climate change mitigation is in fact one of the most highly rated risks. And even more concerning, it's not only the most highly rated risk, or one of the most highly rated, but it's the risk that is the least prepared for, with over 70% of respondents to the Global Risk Perception Survey rating mitigation of climate change as ineffective. And quite frankly, I think that's unlikely to change in the near future. And why is that? Well, we're living in a world right now where what's scientifically necessary and what is politically expedient don't match.